Some people reveal who they truly are only when they believe you cannot understand them. That was the thought running through my mind the night I met my future daughter-in-law's family for what was supposed to be a warm and joyful dinner. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I was 68 years old, a widow, a retired literature teacher, and the mother of a wonderful son named Daniel. For months, Daniel had been talking about Claire Beaumont, the woman he planned to marry. He described her as kind, intelligent, and family-oriented. I wanted to believe every word. After all, every mother hopes her child finds someone who will bring happiness into his life. The dinner took place in an elegant French restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. Crystal glasses reflected the soft glow of candlelight, and quiet piano music drifted through the room. I remember smoothing the sleeves of my navy blue dress and reminding myself not to be nervous. This evening was about building a bridge between two families. Claire greeted me with a bright smile and a polite hug. Her parents were charming at first glance. Her mother, Monique, wore a pearl necklace and spoke with effortless confidence. Her father, Bernard, shook my hand warmly. For the first half hour, everything seemed perfect. We talked about wedding plans, travel, and family traditions. Daniel looked happier than I had seen him in years. Then something changed. The conversation shifted into French. Claire's parents exchanged glances and began speaking more rapidly. Claire joined them. They assumed I was smiling because I was lost. In reality, I understood every single word. You see, what none of them knew was that I had spent more than 3 decades teaching French literature at a private school in Connecticut. I understood not only the language but also every subtle expression hidden inside it. At first, the comments were small. They laughed about how easy it was to impress Americans with a foreign accent. Then Monique looked directly at me and said in French that widowed mothers often become lonely enough to sign anything if they feel included. Bernard chuckled and replied that after the wedding, Daniel would eventually convince me to let go of my lake house in Vermont. Claire lowered her eyes but did not object. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. "The old woman believes she is joining our family," Monique said softly. "She doesn't realize her assets are the only reason anyone is being patient." Around the table they smiled. Daniel continued discussing the wedding venue, completely unaware of what had just been said. I lifted my glass, returned their smiles, and pretended not to understand a word. That was exactly what they expected me to do. I kept my smile in place for the rest of the evening. Years of teaching had given me that skill. When you spend decades standing in front of classrooms filled with teenagers, you learn how to hide surprise, disappointment, and even frustration behind a calm expression. Still, as the dinner continued, every sentence spoken in French felt heavier than the one before it. The strange thing was that Daniel looked completely relaxed. He sat beside Claire with the easy confidence of a man deeply in love. Every time he glanced at her, his face softened. It reminded me of the way my late husband used to look at me across the dinner table years ago. Seeing that expression made what I was hearing even harder to accept. I wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. Perhaps I had taken their words out of context. Perhaps cultural differences made certain comments sound harsher than intended. But the more they spoke, the harder it became to excuse. When the waiter brought dessert, Claire's father casually mentioned my home in Connecticut. He spoke in French, assuming I was still oblivious. He asked how much property taxes cost in my area, and whether the lake house in Vermont had appreciated in value over the years. Claire's mother answered before anyone else could. She said real estate like that was wasted on someone living alone. Then she laughed and said that younger generations knew how to make assets work. I lowered my eyes to my coffee cup. The dark surface reflected the restaurant lights above me. For a moment I found myself remembering my husband, Robert. He had worked for nearly 40 years to build the life we shared. The Connecticut house, the Vermont lake property, the savings we carefully protected. None of it had appeared overnight. Every dollar represented years of sacrifice, long workdays, and dreams planned together. Listening to strangers discuss those things as if they were already theirs left a cold feeling in my chest. Yet I said nothing. The dinner eventually came to an end. Outside, the evening air was cool and carried the scent of the river. Daniel wrapped an arm around Claire and thanked everyone for coming. Claire hugged me and told me how happy she was that our families were finally getting to know one another. Her smile was flawless. If I had not understood French, I might have believed every word. On the drive home, city lights faded behind me as the highway stretched into darkness. I turned off the radio and drove in silence. The road ahead seemed endless. Questions filled my mind. Was Claire aware of everything her parents were saying? Was she simply too afraid to challenge them? Or had I just seen a side of her that Daniel had never been allowed to see? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew one thing with certainty. I could not ignore what I had heard. And before this wedding moved one step closer, I needed to learn the truth. The next few days passed quietly, at least on the surface. Daniel called me twice to discuss wedding details, and I listened carefully to the excitement in his voice. He talked about flower arrangements, guest lists, and possible honeymoon destinations. I responded the way any mother would. I asked questions, offered encouragement, and never once mentioned what I had heard during dinner. The truth was that I needed time to think. Rushing to conclusions would help no one. Still, certain details from that evening refused to leave my mind. The more I replayed the conversation, the more I noticed things I had overlooked before. Claire had remained silent whenever her parents discussed money. She had not corrected them. She had not defended me. She had simply listened. At first, I tried to convince myself that silence did not necessarily mean agreement. Yet the memory continued to bother me. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel invited me to tour a wedding venue with him and Claire. It was a beautiful historic property about 40 miles from my home. The grounds were filled with gardens, old stone pathways, and large oak trees that must have been over 100 years old. As we walked through the venue, I watched the two of them interact. Most couples planning a wedding seem focused on each other. Claire often seemed focused on something else. During the tour, she repeatedly asked questions about ownership, contracts, and long-term maintenance costs. The venue manager answered politely, but I noticed Daniel looking confused more than once. Later, while Daniel stepped away to answer a phone call from work, Claire and I found ourselves standing alone near a fountain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled and commented on how fortunate Daniel was to come from such a stable family. The statement sounded innocent enough. Yet something about her tone made me pay attention. She followed it by mentioning how difficult financial uncertainty could be for young couples. Then she casually asked whether I had ever considered downsizing now that I lived alone. The question was delivered so smoothly that many people would not have noticed anything unusual. I did. I answered politely and changed the subject. Claire smiled again, but her eyes seemed disappointed. That evening, after returning home, I sat in my study and opened an old photo album. Pictures of Daniel filled the pages. School events, family vacations, college graduation. Every photograph reminded me of the same thing. My son had always been trusting. He believed the best about people. It was one of the qualities I loved most about him. It was also the quality that worried me now. As I closed the album, I made a decision. If there was truly something hidden beneath the surface, I would find it. Not because I wanted to stop the wedding, but because I owed my son the truth. The following week brought an opportunity one had not expected. Claire called and invited me to join her for lunch. Her voice sounded warm and relaxed, almost as if the uncomfortable feelings I carried existed only in my imagination. Part of me considered declining. Another part knew that if I wanted answers, I needed to keep watching rather than retreating. We met at a small cafe in a neighboring town. It was the kind of place filled with fresh flowers, handwritten menu boards, and the scent of coffee drifting through the air. Claire arrived a few minutes late, apologizing with a bright smile. For the first half hour, the conversation remained pleasant. We discussed wedding invitations, family traditions, and Daniel's excitement about the future. Anyone watching us would have assumed we were building a wonderful relationship. Then little things began to stand out. Claire seemed unusually interested in subjects that had nothing to do with the wedding itself. She asked how often I visited Vermont. She wondered whether maintaining 2 properties felt exhausting. She even asked whether I had ever considered creating a trust to simplify inheritance matters. Each question arrived wrapped inside concern. Each one sounded reasonable on its own. Yet together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. What troubled me most was how naturally she shifted toward financial topics. The transitions were so smooth that they almost felt rehearsed. When I responded vaguely, She gently redirected the conversation back to the same subjects. By the time lunch ended, I felt less like a future family member, and more like someone being evaluated. On the drive home, memories began resurfacing. I thought about moments during the past several months that had seemed harmless at the time. Claire complimenting my Vermont property after seeing photographs. Claire asking whether Daniel would eventually inherit everything equally. Claire expressing concern that older homeowners often struggled to manage large estates. None of those comments had seemed suspicious individually. Looking back, they felt different, like pieces of a puzzle slowly sliding into place. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The familiar quiet usually brought me comfort. Instead, it brought clarity. The problem was not a single rude comment spoken in French. The problem was that those comments matched a growing pattern of behavior. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had resisted from the beginning. What if Claire's parents were not influencing her? What if she shared their goals completely? The thought hurt more than I expected. Not because of what it meant for me, but because of what it could mean for Daniel. As darkness settled across the yard, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Daniel. He wanted me to come to an engagement planning dinner the following weekend. I stared at the screen for several seconds before replying yes. Something told me that dinner might reveal more than anyone intended. The engagement planning dinner took place the following Saturday evening at a private dining room, inside an upscale restaurant in Hartford. The room was elegant without being flashy. Soft lighting reflected off polished wood tables, and a wall of windows overlooked the city skyline. When I arrived, everyone was already there. Daniel greeted me warmly and pulled out a chair beside him. Claire smiled and kissed his cheek before returning to a conversation with her parents. I settled into my seat and quietly observed. Over the years, I had learned that people often revealed the most when they believed no one was paying attention. Dinner began with harmless discussions about guest counts, seating arrangements, and music selections. For a while, everything felt normal. Then a small moment changed the atmosphere. Daniel stepped away to take an important call from work. The instant he left the room, the conversation shifted. Claire's father leaned back in his chair and exchanged a glance with his wife. They switched to French again. This time they seemed even more comfortable than before. They spoke openly, assuming I remained unaware. Monique remarked that Daniel was completely devoted to Claire, and would agree to almost anything she suggested after the wedding. Bernard laughed softly and replied that loyalty could be very useful when managing family assets. Claire did not appear surprised. In fact, she joined the conversation. Hearing her participate affected me more than anything her parents had said. She calmly mentioned that Daniel disliked discussing money and preferred trusting the people he loved. Then she added that once the marriage was established, difficult conversations would become much easier. Her tone remained casual, almost businesslike. I kept my expression neutral and continued cutting a piece of salmon into small bites. Inside, however, my confidence in her was beginning to disappear. A few minutes later, something unexpected happened. A man entered the room carrying several event brochures. He introduced himself as a consultant helping coordinate luxury wedding services. Claire's parents immediately seemed interested. The discussion turned toward budgets, contracts, and long-term financial planning. Again, I noticed how often they connected wedding conversations to property and wealth. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. By the end of the evening, I had learned more than I expected. Not because anyone confessed to wrongdoing, but because their priorities had become clear. As guests began saying goodbye, Daniel wrapped an arm around Claire and spoke excitedly about the future. Looking at my son, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. He still saw a beautiful love story unfolding before him. I was beginning to see something very different. And for the first time, I realized I might need help uncovering the full truth before it was too late. 2 days after the dinner, I received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. A young man introduced himself as Julien Moreau. First, the name meant nothing to me. Then he explained that he managed private events for several restaurants in the area, including the one where our engagement planning dinner had taken place. His voice carried a note of hesitation, as though he was unsure whether he should continue. I listened carefully. Julian explained that he recognized me the moment I spoke with one of the waiters in French during my first visit. Years earlier, he had attended a summer literature program where I had given a guest lecture. I barely remembered the event, but he remembered it clearly. After a brief pause, he told me there was something I deserved to know. According to Julian, Claire's parents had visited the restaurant several times before our family gatherings. During one visit, they requested a private room and spent nearly 2 hours discussing financial matters with a professional advisor. Normally, that would have meant nothing. Families planning weddings often discuss budgets. What caught Julian's attention was how frequently my name came up during their conversations. He apologized for mentioning it, but he said they spoke openly because they assumed employees would not understand French. I thanked him and asked what exactly had been said. Julian chose his words carefully. He told me they repeatedly discuss future access to family property, inheritance structures, and long-term financial influence after the marriage. More importantly, he mentioned hearing them refer to Daniel as someone who trusted too easily. When the call ended, I remained seated at my kitchen table for a long time. Morning sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. My coffee had gone cold. The house was completely silent except for the ticking of an old clock that had belonged to Robert. I stared at the garden outside my window and thought about everything I had learned during the past few weeks. None of it was direct proof of wrongdoing, yet each piece fit together with unsettling precision. Later that afternoon, I drove to my attorney's office. Robert and I had worked with the same legal team for years. I requested copies of several estate documents and reviewed them carefully. As I turned page after page, I discovered something important. The protections Robert and I had established years ago were far stronger than most people realized. Certain assets could not be transferred, redirected, or influenced through marriage alone. For the first time since this began, I felt a measure of relief. If someone believed they could quietly position themselves around our family finances, they were operating on assumptions rather than facts. As I left the office, my phone buzzed with a message from Claire. She wanted to stop by my house later that week to discuss a small favor related to the wedding. I looked at the screen for several seconds before replying. Something told me that visit would reveal far more than a wedding favor. Claire arrived on Thursday afternoon carrying a bakery box and a bouquet of white lilies. The gesture appeared thoughtful. She smiled warmly as I opened the front door and complimented the garden before stepping inside. If someone had met her for the first time that day, they would have seen a polite, charming young woman preparing to join a family. I invited her into the kitchen, and we sat at the same oak table where Robert and I had shared thousands of conversations over the years. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the room with a calm warmth that contrasted sharply with the questions lingering in my mind. At first, Claire spoke about ordinary wedding matters. She showed me photographs of table settings, discussed menu options, and asked for my opinion on several details. Everything felt natural. Then, gradually, the conversation shifted. She mentioned how stressful legal paperwork could be during major life events. She laughed lightly and said there always seemed to be forms to sign whenever families came together. I listened quietly. A few minutes later, she opened her purse and removed a folder. The movement seemed casual, but I immediately remembered Julian's warning and the discussions I had overheard. Claire explained that the folder contained documents related to wedding logistics. According to her, several vendors required confirmation from close family members who might be contributing financially to certain events. She slid the papers across the table and asked whether I would mind reviewing them. I adjusted my reading glasses and began turning the pages. Most of the documents appeared harmless. Venue agreements, catering confirmations, guest accommodations. Then I reached a page that did not belong with the others. The language was subtle, buried beneath paragraphs of legal terminology. Yet years of reviewing educational contracts and estate documents had trained my eye well. The form included provisions granting temporary financial authority, connected to specific event expenditures. It was presented as a convenience measure, something easy to overlook if a person signed too quickly. I continued reading without reacting. Claire watched me carefully. Her smile never disappeared, but I noticed a hint of tension in her posture. She seemed unusually interested in how long I spent examining each page. Finally, I looked up and thanked her for bringing everything by. Then I told her I preferred having my attorney review any legal document before signing. The change in her expression lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Disappointment flashed across her face before the smile returned. She recovered quickly and assured me she completely understood. A few minutes later, she gathered her things and left. After her car disappeared down the driveway, I remained at the kitchen table staring at the folder. The documents themselves mattered less than what they revealed. For the first time, I had seen Claire test a boundary directly. And for the first time, I was certain that my growing concerns were not the product of imagination. Something was happening beneath the surface, and the people involved were becoming less careful with every passing day. That evening, after placing the folder inside my desk drawer, I drove to Vermont. The lake house had always been my refuge whenever life became complicated. Robert and I had purchased the property more than 20 years earlier after saving carefully for nearly a decade. It was never the largest house on the lake, nor the most impressive. What made it special was the life we built there. Every room carried memories. Every window framed a piece of our family history. When I arrived, the water reflected the fading colors of the sunset, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. I spent the next morning walking along the shoreline with a cup of coffee in my hands. The air was cool, and the sound of gentle waves against the dock reminded me of summers when Daniel was young. He used to race down the path carrying fishing gear that was often bigger than he was. Robert would laugh, load the boat, and spend hours teaching him patience. As I sat on the dock, those memories returned with surprising clarity. Daniel had always possessed a generous heart. Even as a child, he shared everything. Toys, snacks, attention. If another child forgot lunch, Daniel would divide his own meal without hesitation. That kindness never disappeared as he grew older. It simply evolved into trust. Looking back, I realized that trust explained many things. It explained why he rarely questioned people he loved. It explained why he believed promises at face value. Most importantly, it explained why he seemed completely unaware of the concerns slowly forming around him. Later that afternoon, I opened an old cedar chest in the guest room. Inside were photo albums, letters, and keepsakes that Robert had carefully preserved. Among them was a handwritten note he left years before his passing. The message was simple. It spoke about family, responsibility, and the importance of protecting the people we love, even when difficult decisions become necessary. I read the note twice before returning it to the box. By the time evening arrived, my sadness had begun transforming into something steadier. Determination. For weeks, I had focused on understanding what Claire and her family wanted. Sitting beside the lake, I finally understood what mattered most. This was not about property. It was not about money. It was about Daniel. If he was walking toward a mistake, I needed facts before I could help him see it. As darkness settled across the water, my phone vibrated with a new message. It came from Claire. She announced that her parents wanted to host a private family gathering the following weekend before final wedding plans were confirmed. She added that they had something important they wished to discuss with me personally. I stared at the screen for several moments. Deep down, I suspected that conversation would change everything. The gathering took place the following Saturday at Claire's parents' home. Their property sat on several acres outside Hartford and looked exactly like the kind of place designed to impress visitors. The house was beautiful, the landscaping immaculate, and every detail carefully arranged. When I arrived, Monique greeted me warmly and guided me toward the back patio where drinks and appetizers had been prepared. The atmosphere appeared relaxed. Yet beneath the polite smiles, I sensed anticipation. It felt as though everyone had been waiting for a particular conversation to begin. Daniel arrived shortly after I did and spent most of the afternoon helping organize details for upcoming wedding events. Several times, Claire found reasons to pull him away from the group. Each time they disappeared, her parents seemed more comfortable speaking openly with me. Eventually, as the sun began lowering toward the horizon, Bernard suggested we sit together in a quieter corner of the patio. Monique joined us immediately. What followed was the most direct conversation we had shared since meeting. Bernard spoke first. He explained that marriage often required families to think long-term. He discussed financial planning, future responsibilities, and the importance of simplifying complex estates. His words sounded reasonable on the surface. Then he carefully steered the discussion toward my properties. Monique asked whether maintaining both homes had become burdensome. Bernard wondered whether Daniel would eventually need to help manage those responsibilities. Neither question surprised me. I had been expecting something similar. What surprised me was how confidently they continued. Within minutes, they began presenting suggestions. Perhaps the Vermont property should eventually be transferred into a structure that would benefit future generations. Perhaps Daniel should take a larger role in overseeing family assets sooner rather than later. Every proposal arrived wrapped in concern and practicality. I listened patiently while they outlined ideas that seemed remarkably prepared for people who supposedly had no personal interest in the outcome. Then something unexpected happened. Claire joined the conversation. She sat beside her parents and added her own thoughts. Her tone remained calm and friendly, but the message was unmistakable. She described how much easier life could become if financial decisions were organized before marriage rather than afterward. As she spoke, I noticed Daniel approaching from across the yard. The moment she saw him, her language changed completely. The discussion shifted back to wedding flowers and travel plans as if the previous conversation had never occurred. Daniel sat beside me, smiling, completely unaware of what had just happened. Watching him, I felt a deep sadness. Not because I lacked answers anymore, but because those answers were becoming increasingly clear. By the time I drove home that evening, one realization stayed with me. The people around Daniel were beginning to reveal exactly who they were. The only remaining question was how much further they were willing to go. 3 days later, the final engagement celebration arrived. The event was held at a country club overlooking rolling green hills just outside Hartford. White flowers decorated every table. Soft music drifted through the ballroom, and guests moved through the room carrying glasses of sparkling cider and chatting about the upcoming wedding. To everyone else, it looked like a perfect evening. I arrived early and spent several minutes greeting friends and relatives. Daniel looked genuinely happy. Seeing him smile reminded me why I had remained patient for so long. This had never been about proving myself right. It had always been about protecting my son from making a decision without understanding the full picture. As the evening progressed, I noticed something interesting. Claire's parents seemed unusually confident. They moved through the room as though everything was already settled. Several times, I caught them exchanging satisfied glances. Claire appeared equally relaxed. Whatever concerns I once hoped might be misunderstandings had disappeared completely. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Guests gathered near the center of the ballroom for a series of family speeches. Daniel spoke first. His words were heartfelt and sincere. He thanked both families for their support and spoke about building a future based on trust and commitment. The room responded with warm applause. Next, Bernard stood and offered a toast. He spoke about unity, opportunity, and the joining of two families. At first, his remarks sounded harmless. Then he casually mentioned how important it was for older generations to step aside and allow younger people to manage family legacies. Several guests nodded politely. I remained silent. When he finished, Claire encouraged me to say a few words. The invitation seemed innocent. In reality, I suspected they expected another polite speech. I stood slowly and walked toward the front of the room. Every conversation faded into silence. I looked around the ballroom before turning toward Claire, her parents, and finally Daniel. Then I began speaking in flawless French. The reaction was immediate. Bernard froze. Monique's smile disappeared. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. Around the room, most guests looked confused because they did not understand what was being said. But the 4 people standing closest to me understood every word perfectly. Calmly and clearly, I repeated several of the comments I had heard over the past weeks. Not exaggerated versions. Not accusations. Their exact words. The comments about lonely widows. The discussions about property. The assumptions that I would eventually surrender financial control because I wanted acceptance. I watched their faces change as realization settled over them. For the first time since we met, they understood that I had heard everything. And for the first time, they no longer controlled the conversation. For several seconds, no one spoke. The ballroom that had been filled with conversation and laughter moments earlier became completely silent. I could see guests looking from one face to another, trying to understand what had just happened. Most of them did not speak French, But they did not need a translation to recognize discomfort when they saw it. Claire's parents looked stunned. Claire herself seemed unable to decide whether to respond or remain silent. I stood calmly at the front of the room and allowed the silence to settle. Then I switched back to English. I explained that over the previous weeks I had heard many conversations that were never intended for my ears. I told the guests that I had remained quiet because I wanted facts, not assumptions. More importantly, I wanted to be certain before drawing conclusions that could affect my son's future. Daniel stared at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. I could see questions forming in his mind. Before anyone else could speak, I carefully described the discussions about property, inheritance, and financial influence that had taken place during family gatherings. I did not exaggerate. I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated what had been said and explained the circumstances under which I had heard it. Claire finally stepped forward. She insisted there had been misunderstandings. She claimed certain comments had been taken out of context. Under different circumstances, I might have accepted that explanation. Unfortunately for her, the pattern extended far beyond a single conversation. I then revealed that I had reviewed every document presented to me in recent weeks, including the paperwork she had brought to my home. The room grew even quieter. Daniel slowly turned toward Claire. The expression on his face had changed. For the first time, he appeared to be seeing the situation from a different perspective. Bernard attempted to regain control of the conversation by describing everything as ordinary financial planning. Yet his confidence was gone. The certainty I had witnessed for months had completely disappeared. I then shared one final piece of information. Robert and I had established comprehensive legal protections years earlier. The family properties, trusts, and financial structures were secure. No marriage, suggestion, or outside influence could alter them without extensive legal review and multiple safeguards. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. The assumptions that had motivated so many conversations were built upon information that was simply incorrect. Daniel lowered his eyes and remained silent for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his disappointment was impossible to miss. He was not angry. He was heartbroken. And as I watched him process everything unfolding around him, I realized that the most important decision of the evening no longer belonged to me. No one rushed to fill the silence after that. The evening continued, but the celebration everyone had imagined was gone. Conversations became quieter. Guests spoke in small groups. Some chose to leave early. Others remained, not because they enjoyed the tension, but because they understood they had witnessed something important. I stepped away from the center of the ballroom and found a quiet table near the windows. Outside, the last light of day was fading beyond the hills. For the first time in months, I felt calm. Not victorious. Not relieved. Simply calm. The truth was finally out in the open, and I no longer had to carry it alone. A few minutes later, Daniel joined me. He sat beside me without speaking. The silence between us felt different from the silence earlier in the evening. This one carried reflection rather than confusion. Eventually, he looked at me and asked a simple question. "Why did you wait so long to tell me?" I thought carefully before answering. I explained that people rarely accept difficult truths when those truths arrive without evidence. If I had confronted him after the first dinner, he would have been forced to choose between the woman he loved and concerns that sounded impossible to prove. I told him I never wanted to place him in that position. I wanted him to see things for himself. Daniel nodded slowly. His eyes drifted across the room toward Claire and her parents. Whatever future he had imagined only weeks earlier was clearly being reconsidered. Yet even then I felt no satisfaction. Heartbreak is still heartbreak, even when it prevents a larger mistake. Before the evening ended, Claire approached our table alone. She looked very different from the confident woman I had met months earlier. Her expression was tired, and her voice lacked its usual certainty. She apologized. Whether the apology came from regret, embarrassment, or disappointment, I could not say. Perhaps it was some combination of all three. I listened respectfully and thanked her for speaking honestly. Then I wished her well. There was nothing more that needed to be said. As the event came to an end, guests gradually departed. Daniel and I walked outside together. The night air felt cool and clean. For several moments we stood quietly beneath the stars. Finally, He wrapped an arm around my shoulders and thanked me. Not for protecting property. Not for protecting money. For protecting him. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about something Robert once told me many years ago. Character reveals itself when people believe no one is watching. In the end, that lesson proved true. The people who underestimated me revealed far more about themselves than they ever intended. And as I pulled into my driveway and saw the familiar porch light glowing in the darkness, I realized that some endings are not really endings at all. Sometimes they are simply the moment a family finds its way back to the truth.